The silence after the light disappeared was heavy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jake stumbled back toward the cottage, his legs shaky, his chest tight with unspoken fear. Will rushed to meet him, his flashlight trembling in his hand, the beam slicing through the cold air. "What happened out there? What did you see?" Will's voice cracked, betraying his fear. He grabbed Jake's arm as if anchoring him to reality. Jake shook his head. The words caught somewhere between his mind and mouth. It spoke to me," he managed to say, his voice hollow. "In my head, it wasn't just watching us. It's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Will asked, his voice sharp, desperate for clarity. Jake met his younger brother's eyes, and for a fleeting moment he saw a reflection of himself. The same fear, the same need for answers, the same creeping doubt that there would be any. "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but it called itself the Sentinel, and it showed me something." "Showed you what?" Will pressed. Jake hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the dark line of the forest. The images were still burned into his mind. Alien cities, towering beings, and a deep, endless void that felt more alive than empty. A place, not here, another world, maybe, and something else. "I don't think it's just watching us. It's testing us." "Testing us?" Will's voice grew louder, verging on panic. "For what? And why us? Why now?" Jake pulled free of Will's grip and started walking back toward the cottage. "I don't know, but I think Dad knew more than he ever told us." They returned to the cottage, shutting and locking the door behind them. The air inside felt different now, charged with an unshakable tension. Jake dropped the journal onto the coffee table and sat heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. Will sat across from him, his eyes flicking between the journal and his brother. "You think Dad was, what, some kind of UFO investigator? Or involved with these things?" Jake shook his head. "No, he was scared of this place, Will. Don't you remember how he used to make us leave before it got dark? How he always had excuses for why we couldn't come out here anymore? I think he knew. I think he saw something, maybe even talked to it. And whatever it is, it's not finished with us." Will leaned back, his face pale. If he knew, why didn't he warn us? Jake opened the journal again, flipping through the frantic entries. Maybe he thought he did, or maybe he was too scared to tell us the truth. They sat in silence for a long time, the journal lying open between them like a bridge to their father's secrets. Outside, the night remained unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of the forest absent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, a faint noise broke the stillness, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against wood. Both brothers froze, their eyes snapping toward the front door. The sound came again, deliberate and measured. It wasn't the frantic knock of someone in distress. It was something patient, unhurried. "Don't," Will whispered as Jake stood, his face pale but resolute. Jake grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the weight of Will's stare on his back, a silent plea for him to stop, to turn around. But something deeper pushed him forward, a need to confront whatever was out there, to understand what had been haunting them. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so profound it made his ears ring. Slowly, he cracked the door open, just enough to peer into the night. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was a black void. The trees motionless, the air eerily still. But the strange feeling of being watched prickled the back of Jake's neck, stronger now, almost unbearable. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at him. For a moment, nothing. Then, from the edge of the woods, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body unnaturally thin, its limbs long and angular. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were stepping out of another world and into theirs. The glow of the flashlight reflected off of its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was a smooth, featureless surface, black as obsidian and polished like glass. Jake's breath caught, his hand tightening on the door frame. The figure stopped at the edge of the porch, tilting its head in a gesture that seemed almost curious. Jake could feel something pressing against his mind, like fingers brushing through his thoughts. "Jake?" Will's voice was a trembling whisper behind him. The figure raised one long, spindly arm and pointed, not at Jake, but at the open journal on the coffee table inside the cottage. Jake stepped back, his chest tight, his mind spinning. He shut the door, locking it with trembling hands, and turned to Will. "It's here." Will's eyes widened. "What does it want?" Jake looked at the journal, the pages open to their father's frantic scrawl. "Answers," he said. "Or maybe it's here to give them." Jake's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and electric. Will stared at the journal, his mind racing, with questions his mind couldn't untangle. Outside, the porch creaked, a single, deliberate groan of wood that sent a jolt through both brothers. Whatever was out there hadn't left. Jake gripped the flashlight like a lifeline and approached the journal. The open pages seemed to ripple faintly, as though a breeze moved through the room, though the air was perfectly still. He squinted at the words, his father's hurried scrawl suddenly appearing sharper, more vivid than before. "There's something new," Jake muttered, his voice low. Will moved closer, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "What do you mean, new?" "It's Dad's journal. He's gone, Jake." Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the words that seemed to bloom on the page, black ink spreading like fresh wounds. The Sentinel waits. The gate must open. The bloodline binds. Jake recoiled, his chair scraping against the floor. No, no way. I read this page earlier. It wasn't there, Will. This wasn't there. Will leaned in, staring at the ominous sentence as his pulse hammered in his ears. Bloodline? Jake, what the hell does that mean? Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing. He thought about the strange looks their father used to give him when he talked about the stars, about the way Dad always seemed on edge whenever Jake asked questions about their family history. And then there was the old family crest their father had framed in his study, a triangle surrounded by intertwining serpents. It's us, Jake said finally. Whatever this thing is, whatever it's been waiting for, it has to do with our family. Will shook his head, backing away. No, no way. You're saying this thing has been waiting for us? For what? To open some gate? Do you even hear how insane that sounds? Jake slammed the journal shut and stood, pacing the room like a caged animal. I don't know, but it's not just a coincidence, Will. The UFO, the light, Dad's journal, this thing on the porch, it's all connected. Will ran his hands through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. Okay, fine. Say you're right. Say this thing wants something from us. How do we stop it? How do we even understand what it's asking for? Jake stopped pacing, his eyes drifting toward the door. He could feel it now, the presence outside, its gaze pressing against the walls like a storm wind. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting, patient and unyielding. We don't stop it, Jake said, his voice low and resolute. We face it. Will's face paled. Face it? Are you out of your mind? It's not human, Jake. It's not like us. Jake turned, his expression hard. Do you think I don't know that? But if Dad was right, if this thing has been waiting for us, then we're already in its grip. Ignoring it won't make it go away. Before Will could argue, the lights flickered, and a deep hum vibrated through the room. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside them, resonating in their chests, their bones. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tightening against the overwhelming pressure. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, but it didn't last. A voice, soft yet reverberating, filled the room, not from a mouth, but from the air itself, woven into the very fabric of reality. You carry the key. The door waits. Jake and Will exchanged a look, their terror mirrored in each other's eyes. The voice continued, deliberate and calm. Choose. Open the gate or be consumed. The journal burst open on its own, the pages flipping wildly before stopping on a diagram that hadn't been there before. The triangular crest, now detailed with strange symbols and a map leading to a marked location deep in the woods. Jake's hands trembled as he pointed to the map. It's telling us where to go. Will stared at him like he'd lost his mind. No, no way. We're not following that thing's directions. What if it's a trap? What if it's trying to lead us to something worse? Jake clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. We don't have a choice, Will. If we stay here, it'll come for us anyway. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. We have to see it through. Will hesitated, fear warring with the undeniable pull of curiosity. Finally, he grabbed his coat, his eyes dark with apprehension. Fine, but if we die out there, I'm haunting you in the afterlife. Jake managed a grim smile as he grabbed the flashlight and the journal. Deal. They stepped outside together, the cold night wrapping around them like a shroud. The figure was gone, but the air still hummed with its presence. Above them, the stars blazed brighter than ever, their light sharp and unyielding. The brothers didn't speak as they followed the map into the woods, the towering trees swallowing them whole. But in the back of their minds, one thought gnawed relentlessly. They were walking into something far older and far more dangerous than they could comprehend. The forest felt alive, though not in the way nature typically does. Every shadow seemed to stretch and slither as if watching them. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with an unnatural stillness. Even the wind refused to speak. Jake led the way, clutching the journal as though it were a compass. Will followed, his flashlight trembling in his hand, its beam dancing nervously over the path ahead. The map was crude but clear, pointing toward a bend in the river deep in the woods. It was a place they hadn't explored as kids, a place their father had warned them never to go. The trees grew denser as they walked, their trunks twisted in ways that made the brothers' stomachs churn. Some seemed scorched, their bark charred black, while others were covered in a strange, pale moss that glowed faintly in the dark. Are you sure about this? Will whispered, breaking the silence. His voice sounded small, as though the forest itself were swallowing it. No, Jake admitted, his eyes fixed on the map. But we're already in it. There's no turning back now. The path led them to a clearing, the river winding like a silver thread through the darkness. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone obelisk, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer and shift under the light of the flashlight. What the hell is that? Will asked, his voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. He stepped closer, the journal growing warmer in his hands. The symbols on the obelisk were identical to the ones in the journal, their lines pulsating with a faint, otherworldly glow. Jake, I don't like this, Will said, staying near the edge of the clearing. That thing, it's not natural. It feels wrong. Jake approached the obelisk, his heart pounding. As he reached out to touch its surface, the journal snapped shut in his hand, the force startling him. When he opened it again, a single word was scrawled across the page in large, jagged letters. Blood. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. Will, he called, his voice tight. I think it needs a sacrifice. Will's face twisted in disbelief. Are you insane? We're not doing that. We're not playing into whatever this thing wants. Jake turned to him, his face pale but resolute. Look around, Will. We're already playing its game. If we don't do this, it'll come for us anyway. Will shook his head, backing away. No, no way. I didn't sign up for this. There has to be another way. Before Jake could respond, the ground beneath the obelisk began to tremble. A low, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder, deeper, until it felt like their skulls would crack from the pressure. Then, with a sharp crack, a fissure split the ground in front of the obelisk, revealing a deep, glowing chasm. The light emanating from it wasn't like any light they'd ever seen. It wasn't warm or cold, but alien, a living thing that pulsed with intelligence. From the chasm rose a figure. Not the angular, faceless being from before, but something more grotesque. Its body was a serpentine, covered in glistening black scales. Its eyes were too many, too bright, and they all locked onto the brothers with an unsettling focus. "The gate must open," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams. "You carry the key." Jake staggered back, his knees threatening to give out. "What do you want from us?" he shouted. The creature leaned closer, its movements impossibly fluid, its many eyes flicking between Jake and Will. "The bloodline binds, the bloodline breaks." Will's breathing grew rapid, his hands clenching into fists. "What does that even mean?" he shouted. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it extended one long clawed appendage and pointed at Jake. Jake swallowed hard, the journal slipping from his hands and falling to the ground. He understood now. It wasn't just any blood it wanted. It was his. "Jake, don't," Will said, his voice breaking. "You don't have to do this." Jake turned to his brother, his face a mask of determination. "We don't know what happens if I don't." Will stepped forward, his hands gripping Jake's shoulders. "And we don't know what happens if you do. What if this thing's lying? What if it's just using us?" The ground shook again, the chasm widening, its light growing fiercer. The creature's many eyes burned brighter, its voice filling the air once more. "Choose." Jake's heart pounded as he looked from the creature to Will, then back to the obelisk. He knew there was no easy answer, no guarantee of survival, but something deep inside him, something ancient, buried in his blood, whispered that this was what it had all been leading to. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The air around him grew colder, heavier as he reached toward the obelisk, his trembling fingers brushing its surface. And then everything went black. The darkness was absolute, thick and impenetrable, like being submerged in tar. Jake's breath caught in his chest as he reached out blindly, but there was nothing to grasp. Not even the ground beneath his feet felt real. He was suspended in a void, weightless and disoriented. "Will," he called out, his voice echoing strangely as though bouncing off unseen walls. "Will, are you there?" No answer, only silence, vast and consuming. Then a flicker of light, soft at first, like the glow of a distant star. It grew rapidly, blossoming into a sphere of golden luminescence that cast long, shifting shadows in the void. Jake shielded his eyes as the light took form, coalescing into a massive triangular shape that hovered before him. The edges of the triangle shimmered with an almost liquid quality, as if they were composed of molten metal. Its surface was etched with symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat, each beat sending waves of energy rippling through the void. Jake felt it before he heard it, a voice, ancient and resonant, speaking directly into his mind. You stand before the keystone. Jake's legs wobbled, and he dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the thing. What are you? What do you want from me? The triangle tilted slightly, as if scrutinizing him. The symbols on its surface flared brighter. I am the gate and the guardian. I am the lock and the path. You, Jacob Decker, are the bloodline. Jake's head swam. Bloodline? What does that mean? My dad, was he part of this? Did he know? The symbols pulsed again, and images flooded Jake's mind. His father, standing in the same clearing, trembling as he held the journal. The obelisk, the same fissure in the earth, the same figure emerging from the chasm, and then a choice. But his father had turned away. He had closed the journal, walked back into the woods, and left the gate unopened. The images faded, leaving Jake gasping for air. You mean he didn't do it? Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The triangle's light dimmed slightly, as if in acknowledgement. The bloodline chose to hide, but the gate cannot remain closed forever. Jake's chest tightened. He thought about the life his father had lived, isolated, haunted, always watching the stars with a mixture of fascination and dread. What happens if I open it? He asked. The triangle's edges glowed brighter, its symbols pulsating in rhythmic waves. The door will open, the veil will lift, the truth will be revealed. Jake clenched his fists. And if I don't? The triangle's light dimmed again, its presence growing colder. The cycle will continue. The binding will tighten. The bloodline will break. Jake's mind raced. He had no idea what any of it meant. The veil, the cycle, the bloodline. But he knew he couldn't turn back now. Not after everything he and Will had seen. Not after the voice in the woods, the obelisk, the creature. He took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. Okay, what do I have to do? The triangle seemed to hum with approval. The void shifted and Jake found himself standing once more. The obelisk materialized before him, its surface now glowing with the same pulsating symbols as the triangle. A single word burned itself into his mind. Sacrifice. Jake's stomach dropped. Sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Before the triangle could respond, the darkness around him shattered like glass. And he was back in the clearing. The obelisk loomed before him, its glow now intense enough to light the entire area. Will was there, frozen mid-step, his eyes wide with terror. Will, Jake shouted, running to him. He grabbed his brother's arm, shaking him, but Will didn't respond. It was as if he were trapped in some kind of stasis, his body rigid, his expression locked in fear. Let him go, Jake yelled, spinning to face the obelisk. Whatever this is, it's between you and me. Leave him out of it. The obelisk didn't answer, but the ground began to quake again, and the fissure widened. The creature rose once more, its serpentine body coiling around the obelisk, its many eyes fixed on Jake. The bloodline binds, the bloodline breaks, the sacrifice is chosen. Jake felt the weight of those words sink into his chest like lead. He turned to Will, his frozen form illuminated by the obelisk's light. No, Jake said, shaking his head. No way. You're not taking him. Take me instead. The creature's eyes burned brighter, and for the first time, its expression seemed almost amused. The choice is yours, bloodline. Jake looked at Will, then at the glowing obelisk. His mind raced, torn between the need to protect his brother and the unbearable weight of the unknown. The fissure pulsed with light, and the creature's gaze intensified. Jake clenched his fists, his voice trembling as he made his decision. I'll do it. Take me. The forest fell silent. The obelisk dimmed, the creature's eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed as though the very world held its breath. Then the light engulfed Jake, and everything went white.